Hi everyone, I am Alessandro Musu, a PhD student in petrology and volcanology at the University of Geneva, and today I'm really happy to present to you my PhD project. The project mainly aims to study and analyze zonation patterns of experimentally grown crystal in order to study the processes responsible for them formation, and then to quantify the effect of the competition between crystal growth and element diffusion on the zoning. Understanding variation in thermal, chemical, and physical properties within magma reservoir and determining its influence on eruptive dynamics represent an important step for the correct interpretation of eruptive signals and therefore for the mitigation of volcanic risk. In this framework, the geochemical characterization of magmatic rocks and minerals can be helpful to characterize magma transport, storage, and evolution. Indeed, the crystal chemical zoning is an expression of the variation of the thermal and chemical condition within magma reservoirs. But unluckily, studying the processes acting at inaccessible depth from the zoning patterns of mineral is not easy, and different are the reasons behind the complexity of this operation. For example, the crystals are highly mobile in silicate melts, and the silicate melts properties present complex variation in space, but also in time. And for that reason, each crystal can experience really different evolution of the growth condition over time. But the physicochemical variation of the magma properties is not the only process responsible for crystal zonation, has been widely studied as well as the competition between crystal growth and element diffusion in the melts can also be another process responsible for crystal zonation, and this can make harder distinguish crystal zoning produced by element diffusion from the zoning produced by thermochemical variation in the magma chamber. Being able to distinguish between diffusion and growth control and boundary conditions controlled zoning and quantify the effect of the two processes on the zoning formation is a key target of our project. We are trying exactly to disentangle this complexity, having the main target of linking the zoning patterns observed in mineral to processes responsible for their formation, and then to eruptive behaviors. For this purpose, we are growing experimentally zoned crystals under well-known conditions. Natural samples from the 2002-2003 eruption of Mount Etna are used as a starting material in this study. Mount Etna is an active volcano located on eastern Sicily in Italy, and it represents a perfect candidate for our goal. Indeed, Mount Etna shows both a wide range of eruptive behaviors, from effusive activity up to violent explosive eruption, and also shows important geochemical variation in time. We produce homogeneous glasses from the natural samples by multiple steps of grinding and melting at superliquidus temperatures. At that point, the glass powder is ready for the growth experiment. The final product of each experiment is analyzed for measure and trace elements by using electron microprobe analyzer and laser ablation ECP-MS respectively, and the resulting chemical dataset will be analyzed by unsupervised learning methods as clustering, for example. The final goal of this step is to test and improve a new tool for sequencing mineral zoning based on clustering algorithms. The zonation in minerals has been forced inside a high-temperature furnace at the University of Perugia by temperature oscillations, with symmetrical cooling and heat rate runs. This setup has been applied under two different conditions, static conditions and by using a controlled deformation gradient. In the next years, we aim also to introduce a mixing component. Today, I am presenting you the experiment number 4. This experiment was performed in dynamic condition with a constant strain rate of about 1 second to the -1. The temperature has been oscillated between 1130 and 1117 Celsius degrees. The resulting experimental sample presents an assemblage of plagioclase, pyroxene, and skeletal oxide. From a first qualitative observation, as we can see here, the experimental product presents a gradual variation of the plagioclase size distribution moving from the external part of the sample to the core of the sample. Indeed, the core of the sample, the portion of material nearby the spindle, presents in general a higher number of crystals and an increase of small-sized crystal number. Moreover, the plagioclase in this area presents the long axis aligned in the strain direction, but also the zonation pattern of pyroxene presents a variation moving from the external to the internal portion of the sample. As we can see here, the pyroxene far from the spindle present more complex oscillatory zonation, in contrast with the pyroxene nearby the spindles, which present a very simple zonation. This is made due by the higher strain rate near by the spindle that continuously remove the compositional boundary layer which form around the crystals during growth, avoiding the formation of complex oscillatory zonation in the growing interface. In order to quantify the previous observation, the crystal size distribution of plagioclase was calculated on large areas near and far from the spindle. We first segmentate the plagioclase crystal from other phases in the sample, and then we calculate crystal dimension using MAGE software and crystal size distribution according to Higgins 2000 method. As we can see here, the portion nearby the spindle present a higher number of small crystals, and this is probably related with a higher nucleation rate. Moreover, as is evident from these two rows plot, all crystals nearby the spindle present a very high orientation according to the strain rate direction. This feature is probably related with the higher strain rate in this area as well, that strongly influenced the orientation of the plagioclase. As we can see from the CSD, the distribution is not linear, but is represented by a curve, and also as underlined from the linear regression reported as these dotted lines, the plage population curve can be segmented in two families. The smaller size crystal fit in a steeper linear regression, interpreted as the crystal family which only form during the final quenching with a higher growth rate. On the other hand, the less steep line represents the plage family that actually grow during the experiment. In the following growth rate and nucleation rate calculation, we take in consideration only these two families here. From the CSD calculation plot, the linear regression line is directly associated with growth rate and nucleation rate. Indeed, the slope of the line is inversely proportional to the crystal growth rate, and the intercept of the line is directly proportional to the nucleation rate. As it is already evident from the plot, the slope is almost the same for both the crystal near and far from the spindle, reflecting a similar growth rate conditions, and the intercept is a little bit higher nearby the spindle, as we can see here. Growth rate and average nucleation rate has been calculated following the method reported by Hammer and Rutherford 2002. And as we can see, we have similar growth rate in both the analyzed areas, with a nucleation rate a little bit higher nearby the spindle. The higher nucleation rate in this portion of the sample is probably associated with a higher strain rate, affecting the part of the sample nearest to the spindle. Growing crystal under controlled conditions allow us to know the changes in temperature during the crystal growth. Plotting the temperature against the distance from the rim to the core of our experimental pyroxene, we discovered that the brightest area in the backscatter images commonly associated with higher temperatures actually form during the low temperature steps in our experiments. Here I plotted both the aluminum content and the temperature against the distance from the core to the rim of our experimental pyroxene. What we can notice here is that the low temperature zone is associated with a higher content in aluminum, both here and here, as you can see. Is largely studied as disequilibrium growth at high growth rates lead the growing crystal to be less selective in the element incorporation, facilitating the assimilation of aluminum in the lattice. This can reflect an increase in the growth rate during the cooling steps. Usually, the decrease in aluminum content during this fast growth process is associated also with an increase in the incompatible elements concentration in the lattice. For that reason, we have planned to perform trace element distribution maps on the experimental clinopyroxene. We are now planning to set a series of experimental rounds specifically designed to study the effect of competition between diffusion and growth on the zoning patterns. We also want to acquire high-resolution elemental map of both measure and trace element to study the chemical variation on both complex and simple zoned clinopyroxene. And finally, we want to quantify the relationship between the clinopyroxene zoning, the complexity of the clinopyroxene zoning, and the variation in stray rate from the external to the internal portion of our samples. Thank you very much for your attention.